Okay, so welcome. My name is Megan Ressler. I work in the Cancer Education Center at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And we have some people that are here today, a couple of my colleagues and a couple of chaplains, and we'll give more introduction to them in just a bit. So just to let you know our format today, we are going to be having some presentation from our chaplains. There will be an opportunity to respond to some questions that they may ask in the chat function. So if you look on your screen, there's a chat and Q&A function. So they may ask some questions. You can respond if you feel comfortable doing that. And then we will also allow time at the end for you to type a question in and have either Ann or Nancy answer those questions for you. So we're so glad that you're here with us today, whether this is your first time with us or if you have participated in other webinars in the past. We're happy to spend some time with you this afternoon. I'll turn it over to you, Janine.
Okay, great. I'm Janine Kokel, one of the educators also in the Cancer Education Program at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. It is my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce our presenters today. Ann Siverling has her Bachelor of Arts degree in music education from St. Olaf College and also has a Master of Divinity degree from Luther Seminary. She also has an MBA from Bethel University. In addition, Ann has certifications in servant leadership and spiritual direction, and is presently pursuing coursework in thanatology. Ann served as a pastor at 3 different churches prior to completing her chaplain residency at Mayo Clinic. She worked for Heartland Hospice as a hospice chaplain and also backup bereavement coordinator. Ann came to Mayo Hospice in January of 2019 as a hospice chaplain. Nancy Anderson has a Bachelor of Science degree in social work from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and a Master of Social Work degree from Florida State University. She is a certified grief educator, having trained with David Kessler. Nancy has worked in many areas of social work and work including as the social work program director and assistant professor of social work at Warner University. Ann and Nancy are currently bereavement coordinators for Mayo Clinic Hospice in Rochester, Minnesota. So we're delighted to have you here and thank you so much. We're looking forward to your session.
Thank you so much, Janine, for that lovely introduction. I'm going to start us out here, and then Ann and I are going to kind of switch back and forth a little bit. So again, this is just a welcome. We appreciate that you're here, and we hope that you will find this educational and useful for your personal life as well as your professional life. Good shape slides. So some of our goals and objectives, again, we're going to talk about what is loss, grief, and mourning. We're going to discuss normal grief, if there is such a thing as normal grief. We're going to define some special types of grief. Ann is going to talk about that with you. And there really are some specialties that take place in the grief process that can make grief a lot more complicated and difficult to manage. We're going to also talk about the myths of grief. There are many myths you've probably heard out there, and so we're going to try and dispute or dispel some of those. And then towards the end, we're going to offer some support for anyone who may have accumulative grief or just would like to have more support for their grief or someone they know who's grieving. So loss is, again, it's kind of, being without, being deprived of something or someone that you love or have had a relationship with or have some that is important to you. And the fact that losing that person causes us to feel grief. So mourning, sometimes we often get the question, what's the difference between grief and mourning? They're really used interchangeably, but mourning is considered the outward expression of our grief. So it's a process by how do we adapt to our grief? So we've had this loss. How do we adapt to the loss? How do we express our grief? Mourning can be influenced by many different things, culture, different rituals that people have, society's rules plays a big part in how we're able to express our grief. There seem to be quite a few of rules about how we can express our grief and loss. David Kessler has said that we are a grief illiterate society. And I think Ann and I can attest to that because we often get the question, I just don't know what to say to the person. What do I say to someone who's had a loss? And so it's not something that we teach or that we talk to each other or our children about. So hopefully we can change that culture. Next slide. So normal grief, again, is a response to a loss. Could be any loss, okay? Loss of a job, certainly a death of an individual, loss of a relationship. We've all experienced, I feel, a loss of control and security with the pandemic. And again, some people are really struggling with that. Others seem to be able to kind of roll with it, but it definitely has affected how we live. I could just give you a quick example. I was talking to Ann before we started, and my daughter was expected to fly up here from Cincinnati on Saturday. And she is fully vaccinated, and the person she was with yesterday was fully vaccinated. They were riding in the car for over 2 hours, spent the whole day together. And this morning, that other person called and said, I tested positive for COVID. So she's not able to come to Minnesota to spend time with me. And so, you know, I'm grieving that. I haven't seen her since June, and I was really looking forward to seeing her. So I'm grieving that connection. And I think that goes to, again, that feeling of not being in control. You know, we did everything we were supposed to do, but we're still not in control. It requires our attention and our work, grief does. And it is exhausting. It can be very exhausting. It's mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically exhausting. And again, you know, we grieve anything that we have a relationship with, that we spend time with, that we put energy and affection into. And again, so we just want to emphasize it's not necessarily just loss of a loved one by death. There's many types of losses we go throughout life. Next slide. So how we express that grief, then the mourning part, how do we outwardly express that grief, really can depend on so many things. The circumstances of the loss. Okay, was it a sudden loss? Was it expected? Again, the nature of the loss, is a job, a relationship, a death, a move, all kinds of, again, different nature types of loss. The grieving style, you may have noticed with this with people that you know, some individuals are very outward grievers, and you can tell, oh, they're really grieving. You know, they're crying a lot, or they're exhibiting behaviors that you can really tell that they're troubled. And other people are very much inward with their mourning. They don't express it, at least not outwardly, or they would do it privately in, which can lead to other issues. Timing of the loss, is it around birthday? I remember working in the hospital, and I worked in the general inpatient hospice program, and we had a gentleman in there who was actively dying, and family members were there, and they said, "Oh, I hope they would either die today or they'd wait a couple days to die." And that may seem like an odd expression for someone to make, but their niece was getting married on Saturday. And so they didn't want the death to occur on their niece's wedding, which is understandable. So, all those things come into play in how we exhibit our grief. The kind of support system you have. Ann and I do bereavement assessments. And one of the things that we check for is we check to see what kind of support systems do they have. Do they have family and friends around that are able to support them? Do they belong to a church community? Are they involved with any kind of professional counseling program or support groups and different things like that? And so what we have found is that people who have a good support network tend to be able to express their grief in a healthy manner rather than those who have no support system at all. Age at the time of loss, that's a tough one because any kind of loss, no matter what age, your 91-year-old mother or your 10-year-old son, they're both hard. Your husband of 50 years or your husband of 2 years, they're both hard, okay? But again, depending on the person, how they can express that grief and how they exhibit that grief will be different. The griever's background, again, do they have some mental health issues themselves? What are their cultural background? Does that prescribe to them how they can grieve? One of the participants in a group I was doing recently was of Japanese background, and she was saying that the culture is very private, and so for her to be able to express her grief or to even participate in any kind of support group was really a big deal for her because that is not how she was raised. Economic considerations, loss of income. Is that young wife and young mother now without an income for herself and her children? Is that elderly spouse now without an income for herself or himself to continue to do their lifestyle the way they have been doing it? So that can add added stress and very energy, I guess I say energy consuming activity, because if you've ever tried to work with our financial system, you know that there's a lot of paperwork involved in that. So it takes some extra energy. And then the cultural context of the death. Where did it occur? When did it occur? Were they at home? Were they in the hospital? Were they gone on a trip and you weren't there? Same way with any kind of loss as far as relationship. Were they off again? Were they off on a trip and they texted you that, hey, this relationship is no longer working for me? Or did you all of a sudden one day get an email saying we're downsizing and you no longer have a job? So all of those things can affect how you are able to exhibit your grief. And then here's some normal symptoms that people have. I hear often brain fog. I just can't think. I just feel like I'm in a fog. Yep, yep. Inability to focus. Some people exhibit it with physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches. I always say that stress will attack your least resistive part of your body. So if you're prone to headaches, that's where it might hit. If you're prone to digestive issues, that's where it might hit. Spiritual distress. Oftentimes we see that people are angry at God. God, why did you do this? You know, you're supposed to be a loving God. How could this happen? How could you let this happen? Sleep fluctuations. You can imagine people sleeping too much as just a way to avoid even thinking about it or dealing with the grief, or not being able to sleep because they just have so many thoughts and emotions running around. Again, I mentioned tired. You just would be surprised how tired you get and how much energy is used during the grieving process. Feeling of isolation, again, especially for that older couple. They did everything together. They were high school sweethearts, and now they're gone. And they live by themselves, and they have to adapt to a whole new way of living. And then fear, guilt, and anxiety. You know, we do in when Ann and I do pre-bereavement, which is we talk about grief prior to a loss occurring, we try and talk to people about regrets and trying to resolve any regrets they might have prior to the death of an individual, because it's very painful to try and deal with those regrets once a person is gone. Causes lots of guilt and anxiety, and of course tears. And you've probably heard this expression, you know, tears sometimes seem to come in waves. You'll have a wave of tears. Sometimes you don't know it's coming, and all of a sudden you find yourself crying. And other times you might be watching a movie and remind you of something, and then you find yourself crying. And you know what? We say that's okay. Tears are tears of love, tears of pain, and we have to release that pain in order to begin the healing process. I am going to turn it over to Ann now. She has some reflection questions, and then she's going to go through more information about grief and loss.
Thank you, Nancy. We're gonna stop for just a moment at presenting and ask you to reflect on these questions. We invite you, if you are comfortable doing so, to share your reflection in the chat part of our Zoom presentation. We will be watching that, and we can answer any questions there, or just maybe share without naming any names, just some thoughts of what your reflections are. So the question we would like you to reflect on is, what specific symptoms of grief have you experienced? And if you can isolate them, were they body, mind, or spirit, or a combination of any of these? So any thoughts that anyone would like to share?
while people are talking, maybe I could share just a bit. I know when I lost my mother, probably the most close person I was, person I was closest to. And that first few months afterwards was so difficult to, you expect to cry and be upset and go through those difficult emotions initially, but over the next few months, I was surprised at how difficult it was to maintain a sense of control, especially at work. Like I would be in a meeting and I would be completely fine one moment, and then I was a bawling mess the next second. And that happened that took me quite a while to get a process and go through that. And I suspect that's normal, but that was really challenging for me to have that no sense of control of when that was going to happen.
Mhm.
One of the things I hear many times from people that are grieving is, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And no, it's just grief, and it's just part of that process of your mind being affected by it. So
Sure. There's a few comments there that people are
Sure.
sharing, and so I'll go
Mhm.
ahead and read what some people are saying. Weight gain, inability to retain anything I was studying, poor concentration and motivation,
Mhm.
loss of concentration, distancing from those who are close to me and trying to support me, crying, exhaustion, brain fog, unable to focus. Someone spelled it out here with body. On the way home, when her mother passed away, on the way home from being buried, she became ill with pneumonia. In the mind, she was very emotionally abusive. So I was confused about how I felt now that she was gone.
Mhm.
And I'll do just one more here. Mind, body, and spirit. Crying jags stimulated by the merest thought of my father's death when I was 12 years old.
Those are all such valid expressions of grief. And I validate for all of you what you're going through as quote unquote normal. It's part of the process. So great. We'll have more time towards the end so that others can share or have questions. But we're going to move on with the presentation for right now. A couple things that grief is or is not. Grief is not a disease. It would be incorrect terminology to say we recover from grief. We're not sick. This is not an illness. We're not broken. We don't need to be cured, recovered, or fixed. Grief is a normal process. It's a journey. I love this, with rough terrain, winding roads, and steep mountains. Other times it's a peaceful stroll along a meandering brook. I've often heard Nancy say, we journey through grief, but we also integrate it into our new reality. And it's also important to note that no one's grief is greater or less than someone else's grief. We may look at someone who loses a child and say, well, that must be terrible grief, compared to someone who loses their very aged parent. But it's a grief, and one is not worse or better than the other. And we each travel through it our own way in our own style. So again, Nancy said this, and I have to agree with that. Normal grief, I don't know if there is such a thing as normal grief. It's kind of the expectation of what someone goes through with grief. So how can we intervene? What do Nancy and I do? And, how can you be helpful to someone who's grieving? Coping mechanisms, we've all got them. We've got healthy ones and unhealthy ones. But what are the coping mechanisms that have helped you get through other things in your life? And we try and remind people what's helping you cope right now, or what has helped you in the past. Who has helped you in the past, and encourage people to draw on those at this time in their grief work. creating safety for legacy work, and first it has to be a safe place for that. But legacy work is just such beautiful work. It's a time of reflecting on that person's life or your life with that person, telling their story. As long as we tell their story, it's like we keep them alive. And ultimately to find meaning. And one example, of course, is people who take something that's happened to them that's caused them grief and they turn it into something really good, like Mad Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. But it doesn't have to be that big. I had a family I worked with that they decided their loved one's legacy was the house he had built on a lake shore. And they used that house as sort of a metaphor for his life. So that's another way of having legacy. Acceptance of the loss. We don't to try and fix anything. Just helping them accept it. And to ask what we can do. One of the most, what I hear from people who are grieving is one of the most hurtful things is when people offer platitudes, like they're in a better place. And your heart just saying, no, their best place was here with me. And so how to say things that, or not say anything sometimes that could be actually more hurtful. And we say this all the time in our work, there are no shoulds, coulds, woulds, if onlys, or what ifs. Like when people say to you, and I've had bereaved come and say this to me, so-and-so said to me, you should be moving beyond this by now. You know, there's no should in this. If this person is moving through their grief more slowly, that's what they have to do. So, and the what ifs. What if I hadn't moved mom into the nursing home? What if I'd been able to care for her at home? And there's really, that doesn't get us anywhere, the what ifs and the shoulds and coulds. It's better to just sort of say, this is what it was, and this is what it is, and how do I start coping from this place and time? The most important thing you can do is just listen, you know, and I chuckle because someone watching me at work, I might be sitting at my desk with my headphones on, and I might sit there for half an hour looking at the screen and not say one word. But I'm working, I'm listening. So active listening takes some focus, but just to listen and be supportive. So I'm going to go through a few types of grief that are outside the bounds of normal, although them occurring is a normal occurrence that it happens. So the first one is an ambiguous loss. And that means it occurs without closure or clear understanding. A few examples of some of these losses, some of them relate to death and some do not. But immigration, adoption, abandonment, of someone being, a family member being incarcerated, someone who's in the military, divorce, discovery of infidelity or betrayal, the witness of a loved one's deterioration from something like Alzheimer's, or even just the change or termination of a relationship, just even moving away from one's friends. All of these cause an ambiguous loss that is just not clear, and there's not a nice, neat closure around it. So the ambiguous grief then is often some sort of grieving about someone who is still alive, but there's a loss and unresolved grief. Anticipatory grief is grief that happens while the person is still alive. And this is very common in cancer or other diseases that cause a slow and gradual decline or deterioration. A few things about anticipatory grief is some people think, I was anticipating my spouse's death, so I probably won't grieve so much when they do die. That's not necessarily so. They may be surprised by how much they're still grieving the loss of that loved one. For other people, that is true, that they've been grieving the loss of that person so gradually over time that when their loved one does die, they actually feel relief. And usually upon the heels of that relief comes guilt because they're feeling relief. And so none of this is bad. It's just what it is, and that we recognize all of this is real and valid. Delayed grief. It's exactly what it sounds like. Grief that we postpone and it comes back later. Sometimes this can happen when a person experiences several losses right in a row, like two parents die, one right after the other, and it's just too much all at once, and so we just push it aside and get to it later. I do hear from a lot of people that are grieving, they say, if I just stay busy, I don't have to think about it. And ultimately that busyness will just sort of push the grief and it will come back. I often tell people grief will not be denied. It's like any other natural process. It has to take place. Disenfranchised grief. This is one where the person who's grieving kind of doesn't fit in. This could be things not death related, like treatment, rape, infertility, miscarriage, and mental illness, but it can also be part of the grieving around a death. For someone like, for myself, for my ex-father-in-law, when he passed away, I missed him and wanted to go to his funeral, but wasn't sure if I had a place there. And in my case, I simply called my ex-husband and it worked out just fine. I was welcome there. But in some situations, someone may be deeply grieving that loss, and yet they can't really show that publicly or can't go to the public events like a wake or a funeral. So what do they do with that grief? So now we have complicated grief. And Nancy talked a little bit ago about how we assess a person, what are their support systems and what they have around them to help them with their grief. What we're assessing at that point is, what is the risk of that bereaved person to develop something called complicated grief? And we would like to help them avoid complicated grief if we can. The definition on the screen, the key word for me in this definition is maladaptive. It's when the grief just stays on so long that people can't kind of live normally like they used to in the past. And I think that the final sentence in that definition is just so telling and so poignant. This complicated grief keeps sufferers trapped in their pain and their sense of loss. I had, in my work as a pastor, I had a woman from my church whose daughter was killed by the daughter's husband. And when I met this woman, it was 10 years after her daughter had died. And her grief was still so raw. And what happened was her grief came out as inappropriate anger towards those who didn't deserve it. So that would be an example of maladaptive behavior that we're trying to avoid. Of note, it's complicated grief actually has a definition in the DSM-5, meaning it's an actual diagnosis. So I hope I got that right, Nancy. So.
Yes, you did.
So those are the types of grief. We're now going to open it up for another time of reflection on our question. This one might be a little more difficult, but we ask you to think of a time when either you or someone you knew experienced one of these special types of grief. Do you realize, or did you realize it was something other than normal grief? And how did you or the one you know cope with it? So I invite you into that question.
I'm just going to jump in a little bit here, Ann, and say that when you were talking about this, I saw someone put in the chat, they felt delayed grief when their father had Alzheimer's. And that, as we know, is a progressive disease, and sometimes it takes, a long time. You're grieving each step of the way.
And I have heard others say this, and I experienced it myself with a loved one, where I actually said, I had said goodbye to the person I knew and loved years ago. The person, when that person finally died, was no longer the person I knew.
Okay, so I've had a couple comments that have come in. One was related to ambiguous grief and feeling that that describes the family's loss of the father due to Alzheimer's and how much he has changed. Another one, I was told, oops, it moved here. Sorry. I was told by my doctor that I'm having anticipatory grief, and I actually haven't been able to deal with that as of yet. Suicide, hard for people to talk about and hard for me to share when I've experienced that, and losing a family member. When my brother died, my favorite aunt died the year before, around the same time. The year before my mom died, and I lost my husband to cancer 30 years prior, but it came back like it was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Diagnosed with cancer, I didn't know I was grieving for myself until a social worker told me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those are all so real, so valid.
Yes.
And I just want to make a quick comment here that if people are experiencing grief and feeling like you don't have the resources to cope for it, the work that Nancy and I do is available to people who have not lost a loved one on hospice. So we work in what we call community bereavement. And so we are open to supporting people outside the bounds of hospice. So if you think that's you can just call Mayo Clinic Hospice and ask to talk to one of us, and we would be happy to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to pass this back to Nancy, and we're going to do some myth busting.
Okay. Again, thank you all for your comments. So poignant, so true. What your comments were. So again, we thank you for that. So yeah, the myths about grief, and you guys have probably heard some of these. The pain will go away faster if you ignore it. Why do you keep bringing it up? Right? Well, guess what? We need to talk about it, don't we? We need to have our grief witnessed. And by having our grief witnessed is having a supportive person listen to us tell our story or tell our loved one's story. It's important to be strong in the face of loss. That is a myth. Okay, and I've talked to parents, and Ann probably has too, who feel they have to be strong. If they have small children, even teenage children, the parents have said, well, I feel I have to be strong for my kids. And how do we learn behaviors? We learn behaviors from watching other people, right? We have role models and people, whether they're good or bad, behaviors, we learn both. And so exhibiting our grief appropriately or in a normal way, crying in front of our children, that's okay. That gives them the message that it's okay for them to cry too. And it's okay for them to be sad sometimes. Again, if you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss. You know, how foolish is that? Just prior to starting the webinar, I was, like Ann said, on a phone call with a bereaved, staring at the screen for about an hour. And she was just, you know, talking and talking, and which was wonderful. She delightful. And she said, yeah, I'm not a crier. That's okay. Not everyone is a crier. But if you feel like crying, it's okay to cry too. And as Janine, you pointed out, sometimes you just don't have control over it. It just comes, whether you're expecting it or not, you know. Grief should last about a year. Back when I was doing my bachelor's degree, which was a long, long, long time ago, that was one of the beliefs about grief. It's about a year. You have to get through every one of those 1-year anniversaries, and then you can move on. You're done. You know what? That is not true. Those 1-year anniversaries, they do come up and they do give us pause sometimes, but so does the 2nd and 3rd and 4th anniversary. Okay, so hopefully the pain is not as intense as we go through, but really the first couple years of grieving are very normal to have those reactions. You know, it's not, you don't get over grief in 1 year. Moving on with your life means you're forgetting your lost, your loved one who you lost. No, life goes on whether we join in or not. That's just a fact. And so we need to integrate, like Ann said, I like to use the word integrate. We need to integrate our loss into our life. We bring it forward with us. I think Brene Brown was the first one I heard talk about this, is that you know, she lost her first husband, and she said, he's just not back there, and I don't ever think about him, even though I'm remarried. He's with us. He's integrated into our lives. And so that's very important. Friends can help by not bringing up the subject. I don't know how many times I've had people say, you know, my friends are uncomfortable if I want to talk about my loved one, or if I bring up his name or her name. And that's unfortunate. And that's, again, why David Kessler says we're a grief illiterate society, because we don't recognize that people need to talk about their loved ones, and they want to. As Ann said, that keeps them alive for us. And in the end, all of us want to make sure that our life mattered, okay, and our loved ones' life mattered. And so by telling their story and telling our story, that keeps it going. Grief follows a logical linear path. No, not at all. I don't know if I have, I don't know if this will show up, but I have this. Can you see that? No.
Kind of blurry.
Or blur. So what it is, it says the mess of grief, and it has like a U shape, and it's scribbled all over, because you go from one emotion and one feeling to another. The pain will go away faster if you ignore it. No. As Ann said, the pain will come out somehow. Might come out as anger towards someone who doesn't deserve it. It might come out by eating too much, might come out by drinking too much. It's going to come out. That pain has to find its way out. The goal is to get over grief. And again, you've heard me say, do you really get over it? I mean, is it a mountain you climb and then you're on the other side and you never think about it again? No, you integrate it, you bring it along with you. And in the previous description, Ann used, I like to think of grief as this body of water that's moving. And at the beginning, it might be rapids, like really wild rapids, and then it might smooth to maybe more bubbles than rapids, and maybe eventually it might be a babbling brook. But if you've ever watched a body of water like that, sooner or later it might come to a waterfall. That calm babbling brook all of a sudden has a waterfall in it. And so don't be surprised that the journey of grief takes you in many different directions. Tears expressing grief are only a sign of weakness. No, please, not at all. Tears expressing grief are an expression of love, are expression of pain. They're an expression of strength, that I'm willing to let you see my vulnerability because I'm hurting. Time heals all wounds. I think we've all heard that. One of my coworkers said, it is not time that heals all wounds. It is what you do with that time that heals the wounds. And I thought, wow, yeah, that's right. Am I expressing my grief? Am I getting support from my grief? Am I seeking support from my grief? So what am I doing? Just keep busy. I've heard that. Just keep busy, and well, keeping busy might help for a little bit, but again, that grief needs to be expressed, and that pain is going to come out somehow. So I might break a few things if I just keep busy. I might accidentally, I don't know, destroy something. Need to be strong for others. No, we talked about that. And it's just easier to replace loss. And unfortunately, sometimes you see that, especially in elderly individuals or older individuals who've been with their loved one for 50, 60 years, and they just can't even face the idea of living alone. And they make it into a relationship sooner than probably is healthy for them to do. I have certainly seen that more than once, where, wow, they're in a relationship already. So, yeah. Okay, next. And this is where Ann talked about support for grief, for accumulated grief. I forget who said that they had multiple losses. We also identify that as accumulated grief, because you're right, one loss brings up a previous loss, and so on and so forth. So what we can do is listen. Again, David Kessler says everyone needs their grief to be witnessed, and that is just listening. Validate their loss. Wow, I'm so sorry you had that experience. I'm sorry you're going through this. Is there anything I can do to help? And one thing I found out when I was going through grief, people would say, let me know if I can help you in any way. And we never do we? someone said, how about tomorrow night, I'll bring a hot dish over for supper for your family. Okay, because the chances are I wasn't going to ask for their help, probably. But if you say I'm going to do this and then follow through with it, that will be very supportive. There are support groups not only through our program, but through many of the churches, other hospice programs, what am I missing? And funeral homes. Some funeral homes offer support groups as well as professional organizations. Seek professional counseling. I strongly support that. It's a hard road to go through grief. And it's okay to seek out professional help. And then some specifically for staff of Mayo, we have the Mayo Help Peer Support Program, and these are all listed on the Mayo intranet. Of course, we have the Employee Assistance Program. There's a web page, mental health and wellbeing.mayo.edu, that has all kinds of different resources on it that can be accessed. And then when to refer, anyone can refer. You can refer yourself, please, or you could refer a loved one if you feel that they are expressing homicidal or suicidal ideation. Complicated grief, they have multiple losses, or they really are, their grief is so overwhelming and painful to them that they really can't move on with their life. They can't get out of bed. They can't fix their meal. You know, activities of daily living are greatly impacted. And then if they have limits of service, again, we know in rural Minnesota, there isn't always, services, and families are so mobile these days. Families don't always live in the same area anymore. So that may prompt you to need to refer someone to get service. I think the rest is just all of our resources and references, and this will be up on the recording when the recording gets posted. So if you are interested in any of these resources, you can certainly look them up. Do we have time for questions?
We do. So thank you, Ann and Nancy, for sharing all that good information that you've had for us. I'm going to look here and see.
There was a couple of
the question. If you see that, Janine, you can say something.
There was a question about if you could speak a bit to that brain fog that goes along with grief. There's someone that's expressing concern about that.
Sure. So the brain fog is you just feel like you can't really put your thoughts together. I mean, people are talking to you and you're like, you're listening, you're thinking you're getting it, but you couldn't repeat what they told you if they asked you to repeat it back. It's just like you're in this fog in your brain. And I mean, it does clear. It's not a permanent condition, but you can really feel, your brain can kind of feel that when you're in the intense and active part of your grief. Anything to add to that, Ann?
Are there some tips for dealing with that or with some of these emotions?
I think just be patient with yourself.
Yeah.
Because we can't really make it go away. Another really good example would be my mom, who was an avid reader. And when my dad died, one day she said, "Ann, I just can't read. I read the same page over and over again and have no idea what I read. So it's just that inability to focus in long enough to read one page in the book.
Mhm.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I know
And
that's-
yeah, I
I'm
tell
sorry.
people all the time, be patient with yourself. We're the hardest on ourselves most of the time. And so give yourself a break. Grief is hard work, no matter what the loss. It's hard work. And it's overwhelming at times. And so we need to give ourselves patience. And again, the more you tell your story, the easier it gets to tell your story. And each time you're releasing a little bit of that pain with it. And pretty soon you'll find maybe you're chuckling a little bit now when you tell it. You know what? He used to always do this and it made me so mad. And you could chuckle about it where, before you couldn't. So.
I think it's a good message to make sure we're kind to ourselves, because
Right.
we're not always kind to ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
there's another comment or question in terms of trying to deal with a family member, actually a parent who has been maybe not coping well, and so lashing out at family members, lashing out at the children, and who are trying to help, and they don't know how to help.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is a real tough one. Being patient with them too, but asking questions like, Dad, I don't think you're really angry at me. What are you upset about? If you can get at it from that angle, asking questions is usually a helpful method to get them to at least, maybe they might express with anger, but at least they are still getting it out. Ann, what are your thoughts?
I think you've summarized that really well.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
I guess it depends too on how long that anger's gone on. I would
Mhm.
is it progressing into this complicated grief, this prolonged grief, where some outside help might be available to you and helpful to the situation?
Yeah, especially if you see some of those maladaptive behaviors that Ann talked about, the anger coming at people who really don't deserve the anger, and in a prolonged sense, but also they're going to the bars, or they're going to the liquor store, and you feel that they're consuming a lot of alcohol where that wasn't really something they did before. Those could be some tips that you need to seek help for them.
And especially with an elderly parent, has this parent always exhibited anger? Or is this something very different?
Right.
And many times with dementias, we see changes in personalities. Is that going on? So even just a suggestion to go see their doctor might be helpful at this juncture.
Yeah, excellent. And
Thanks, Susie.
Well, this has been a fantastic, excellent webinar or session. Thank you so much to both of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to share your experiences, your love, your compassion, your knowledge. And we've gotten many, many comments about how appreciative people are for being able to participate in the session.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
people have expressed their appreciation. I will just say to everyone who's watching this, I encourage you to reach out for help if you're in this situation of grief and loss and feeling isolated, or like your mental health is suffering from that. And sometimes that's the hardest step to take in the process, is to call a friend or call a professional. But we do like to love and support one another. So I just encourage people to do that. We will have this recording up and available on our Mayo Clinic Connect site. It takes a little bit of time for us to get it converted, but we will post it there. We have more webinars that are coming up, so I encourage people to like and follow us on Mayo Clinic Connect. I know some of you find it on Facebook and Twitter and other places, but it drives you back to Mayo Clinic Connect. So if you want to do that, share this with other people that may benefit from the information that was shared today too. So we appreciate all of that. So thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Ann, for taking time, and thank you for all the people that are here watching and participating today. We wish you well.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for having
everyone.
us.
Yeah.